Welcome to the second in the discussion or conversational episodes about the historically momentous events that happened over the weekend. Of course, we don't know the full causes, we don't know the full consequences of that. In this episode, we are going to very much focus on the potential consequences of what happened to Trump and the images that are seared into our brains of that event. I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to welcome two of my favorite YouTubers whose material I watch religiously. I know there'll be other people on the channel who do the same. Vlad Vexler. He's been on the channel a number of times, and Vlad has been incredibly supportive, actually, in helping to grow this channel. And indeed, his insights, I think, are incredibly important to anybody involved in this space. He's a social philosopher and absolutely unique YouTuber. Please do check out our previous conversations on the channel. Everything Vlad says is definitely thought-provoking and extremely insightful about the Russian mindset and the roots of the war. I'm also joined by Jonathan M.S. Pierce, who is a philosopher, author, columnist, and public speaker with an interest in writing about almost anything from skepticism to science, politics, morality, to the environment, essentially because, as he says, everything is philosophy. He is a former teacher and is now battling primary progressive multiple sclerosis. And again, with Jonathan, we've had lots of absolutely thrilling conversations on the channel. And Jonathan actually took an extraordinary risk by going to Ukraine earlier this year to really see things at firsthand, which I think we very much benefited from the sort of videos and insights recorded there. Gentlemen, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much. Good to be here again. Always a pleasure, never a chore.
Well, let's jump into the very first point here. And this is one I asked in the other panel. This is the question that's going to be in common to the two, but I think it's interesting. We see on social media, we even see on legacy media, an absolute obsession with the causes of what happened over the weekend, the attempted assassination of Trump. That perhaps is to be expected. My fear here is that the coverage is going to remain stuck in this divisive, partisan, mudslinging kind of mode. And that's not just confined to social media. That legacy media are going to be falling into those kind of patterns as well and not focusing on the consequences. Is this a concern for you as well, Vlad?
Yeah, it's a huge concern. One of the things that I rave on about like a lunatic and plan to rave on about till the rest of my life is that democracies really get into trouble when they start transferring themselves from the politics of opponents to the politics of enemies, and you just don't get any more extreme an expression of the politics of enemies than assassination and attempted assassination. It's really the paradigm case of that. And the politics of enemies is the enemy of democracy, of course. So this is incredibly worrying because it's not just an expression of the degree to which the world's greatest democracy and most flawed democracy at the same time is lapsing into a politics of enemies. It's also the case that events like this accelerate such a process. So that's the double worry. And that's why it's incredibly important to take at least 5% off your bounciness, pushiness, excitement about pushing your own message, whatever your political position is, and depolarize. That's really an important message for Americans. But it's also an important message for all of us, because that stuff is going to happen everywhere, might not take the form of attempted assassination. And what that depolarization really means is being extraordinarily slow. Means more than that, but that's the main thing. It means being extraordinarily slow to add any buts to the thought that in a democracy, political violence is bad. So you want to say it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, and there aren't going to be any buts added. And back to your question, am I worried that the United States as a civic entity is going to struggle to do that? Well, it is already really struggling to do that, and I'm really worried about that.
Jonathan.
There was nothing I disagree with there. Absolutely spot on, as you would expect from Vlad. What I would like to add is that although it's very important to talk about the consequences themselves are defined by the causes, or they are contingent on the causes. Because actually, if this was, for example, a democratic activist who was, really intensely pro sort of Biden and reproductive rights, and I don't know, those kind of ideas, then that will entail a very different response from Republicans, from everyone, really. But if this person was a lone, troubled soul, kind of the sort of shooter that maybe we've seen in Columbine or whatever, some other situation, that isn't someone that's politically motivated in the way that many have reacted to this. Many have thought this was some kind of huge democratic, I don't know, cabal or conspiracy theory or whatever, and that's happening on both sides. But then that will change how people react to this. It should change how people react to this, because if it is a troubled soul, then we need to have a conversation about mental health, about access to guns, etc., rather than retreat into a tribalism of us and them, and the idea that it's Biden what did it. And we are starting to hear more and more things come out to suggest, okay, he was a registered Republican. And I've now heard this afternoon that he didn't give $15 to a Democratic fundraiser, that actually that was a different Thomas Crooks that lives in Pittsburgh. And actually, this isn't the sort of person that most people reacted to initially, such as Marjorie Taylor Greene and JD Vance and people that jumped on the tribal bandwagon. And actually, had people been a bit slower to react, which is possibly what Vlad was saying there, just take a second to make sure that we have some better information coming in, not be so knee-jerk, then actually the reactions would have looked very different, I think.
There's a really interesting response I found from Russian media, who could have gone for the unsubtle approach, but I suspect they're starting to realize that they don't need to pour a whole ton of kerosene on this fire to get it going. All it requires is a gentle nudge with a little bit of not even kindling, but a couple of squirts of lighter fluid, and up it goes. Their response was to hint that it was Biden who has created the atmosphere of violence. And there's nothing specific in there. It's quite a malleable kind of message you can do all sorts of things with. And almost immediately you found the Russian message seeded in Russian media openly and in plain sight being immediately copied almost verbatim by a whole range of different sources. So there's a double barrel question here. Does Russia realize that it doesn't have to go all in order to create this divisive atmosphere in the US? The US is doing rather a good job of that itself. Has it already laid the groundwork for this? Therefore, it doesn't have to try too hard at this point. And what are we likely to see from Russian propagandists in terms of further stoking of division?
I think that the most important thing to realize about the way the Russians work is that they are not trying to divide us over things that we aren't divided over. They're trying to divide us more deeply over things that already divide us. And one of the aims of that enterprise is, of course, to make our problems, which already exist, worse. But another is to make us epistemically confused about which problems are domestic and which problems are foreign. And that's one of the biggest things that emanates as a harm out of Russian propaganda efforts. They say something like this, that it's tendentiously about an atmosphere Biden has created. And the point is that that's intended to seed epistemic crisis. But the other thing about it that's intended to seed epistemic crisis is that we start fighting with each other about the impact of this Russian propaganda, and that itself becomes an expression of polarization in the West. And so it's not just that they think that our democracies are anyway in an inexorable pattern of decline. That's what they think in the Kremlin. They're half wrong. But that they also think that one way to sink us is to make us fight with each other about what is malign foreign interference and what is the domestic organic challenge. But the bottom line is, yes, it's absolutely standard, just as you suggest, John, that the Russians are going to try to pick the things that are already the most toxic, vicious, and dividing points in our culture, and then press on those. What I haven't said in any of my answer is what effect this Russian intervention has, that's a separate conversation, on our divisions. Does it deepen them a bit, infinitesimally, or a huge amount? I'm not legislating on that in my answer, but I just emphasize that because I don't want people to think that I'm saying that Russians are driving our divisions. I don't think they are.
They are certainly amplifying our divisions, and that's something Vlad has so eloquently said. They do that over culture wars topics so particularly well because they are such divisive ideas in particularly the American political landscape. And it's the advantage the Russians have is they don't need to be right on anything, because confusion, as Vlad mentions, confusion is kind of both the means and an end. They want to sow confusion, but that is then a means to all sorts of other ideals. But they want confusion, and in order to sow confusion, you can sow all sorts of lies. There are no consequences to Russia being picked up by being fact checked by the West. Their domestic audience, either can't access that or doesn't want to know about it, and unfortunately, the reality is that truth travels 6 times slower than lies, and so therefore, you can spread disinformation and lies, and it does damage. And you sit back and eat the popcorn and watch as it wreaks havoc amongst the American population, particularly, but Europe as well. They're so well versed in sowing disunity, and that is, as Vlad said, all about amplification of already existing problems. It's not like immigration is made up out of whole cloth by the Russians as an issue for Europeans, as an issue that exists there, but they will amplify it so that people feel it is more of an issue than it really is, or they will lie about it in certain ways, but the actual core problem is pre-existing. And here they are playing on divisions in the American political landscape that are, sadly, it's a two-party system, so it's a narrowest form of democracy, and that leads to a polarization, and that just means that it's ripe for being able to sow really divisive ideas and rhetoric to see how it all explodes out into unfortunately either causing things like this, or, which I don't think that necessarily happened here, but they will absolutely opportunistically capitalize on these kind of events to sow further discord amongst the Americans.
And Trump's I was about to say Trump's age, Biden's age clearly is not something Russia has invented at all. In fact, it's something that I think even his ardent supporters are mindful of, and there is a debate going on, and there was a debate going on about whether he'd step aside. And I think some really significant sort of donors and members of the party have been privately advocating for that. Some of them indeed publicly, like George Clooney. So again, this is an issue that's been created, but the Russian media has really gone to town on this idea of his senility and unfitness for office. And of course, this is one of the classic sort of Russia Today type tactics. You'll only pick up on the weakness of one side. You won't critique the weaknesses and problems of the other side. So can we safely assume that Russian media, Russian propagandists, indeed Russian strategists, are really rooting for Trump to win? Do we see in their actions, their coverage, narratives that they're sort of amplifying? Does that sort of point us towards a preference they may have, or is division the ultimate objective?
So in 2016, my view is that they didn't prefer Trump because they largely didn't think he could win. They fell for the centrist US illusion that Trump wouldn't win. And that in itself is a reflection of the fact that their understanding of our politics is really limited. Let's think about everybody watching this. Now, you've heard a lot about Ukraine and Russia, of course, other countries too, but you've heard a lot about these two countries in the last couple of years. How well do you know their politics? Dear viewers in Sweden, in Canada, the United States, you have a good sense, but still your knowledge is pretty limited, right? If we started talking in any detail about the Ukrainian government or the Russian government, you'd run out of steam very quickly. So that's what it's like not to understand a foreign country, even though you constantly engage with what's going on in it. I mean, you've got to be epistemically humble here. And that's the predicament the Russians are in a somewhat more extreme way. They're not just limited in the way they understand us. They have some systemic prejudices that obstruct them from understanding us well. So that's an important thing to put down on the table. If we struggle to understand Putin, which we do, I mean, it's the position of the Biden administration still, and it's Joe Biden's personal position, that we have to be epistemically neutral when it comes to Putin. We don't know what he's doing or why he is doing it. And I would argue the Russians are even worse than we are at understanding them or understanding us. In 2016, they wanted a weakened Hillary, basically. They would have taken Trump happily, but they didn't feel he could win. So they wanted to promote Trump as a means of destabilizing US democracy until he, in a destructive way, eventually lost to Hillary. Today, my assessment is that they support Trump. My assessment is that they don't want to use Trump as a disruptor, that they prefer him in office because they think he can win. Now, is this preference triumphant on their part? No, they don't feel good about Trump. So there is a gap between some of the more glib messages of television propaganda, it seems to be what they think in the Kremlin. In the Kremlin, they see Trump as weak, unreliable, systematically unable to form an elite around him in his first term, and thereby a political actor without any real connection between his speech and his actions. So he's a mess to deal with. They do hope that Trump will be better at forming an elite around him. This is an entirely correct assessment, by the way, of Trump's first term. He failed to form an elite around him and do as much damage as he would have liked. He'll do better in the second term, but the question is how much better, and that's a matter of Trump realizing also himself that that was a problem and being keen to fix it, but also not having the political discipline, the hard-nosed political seriousness of somebody like an Orban or a Putin to push this project through well. So these are all thoughts in the minds of Russians. It sounds like I'm contradicting myself because I've said they don't understand us, but here I'm saying they do understand Trump reasonably well. So they are cautiously in favor of Trump, knowing that it might not work out as well as they would like for them. So they have hopes, but their realistic expectations are that he will fail to be as favorable to Russia as they would like him to be. But my assessment, bottom line, is yes, they prefer Trump to win and Biden to lose.
I would say Trump's isolationism and the idea that Ukraine has become a partisan issue in the US in a way that you wouldn't have predicted, say, 30 years ago under a kind of Reagan umbrella or however long that was ago. But the reaction of the US to this threat of Russia, the Russian Federation now as this new iteration of the Soviet Union, is bizarrely un-Reagan-like from the Republican Party. And so it is this really partisan affair. And as such, I think they would obviously prefer Trump now. And that's but that isolationism might indeed be due to some of the influences from Russia themselves. But I think the thing about Trump is, as far as I'm concerned, he's actually ideologically fairly vacuous. So he's someone that doesn't particularly have much of a moral compass that has been on show for a long time. Take abortion, for example. He's had, what, before 2016, he had 5 different views on abortion. He says what other people want. He says whatever he thinks people want to hear, particularly from his own electorate. And so he's, I think, probably easily malleable. So therefore, it depends on who's around him, the elites or whoever it is he has around him. And in the 2016 tenure that he had, he wasn't expecting to win. Like, Russia wasn't expecting to win. No one was really expecting him to win. And as a result, he wasn't very prepared when he went into the first administration. But actually, if he has a second administration, they are very much better prepared. Now, there's been a lot of controversy over Project 2025, but the people who have been writing that and the people involved around him are much, much better prepared. So if Russia want to be able to understand and predict Trump, they need to understand and be able to predict the people around him. And that's super important. I was wondering, Vlad, what you were thinking about projection, whether, because I've heard previously from analysts that Russia often projects onto other nations maybe ideas that they have themselves, maybe thinking that other nations would be far more corrupt than they really are, that these kind of endemic corruption issues would be issues that all nations have. So I wonder whether there's an element of projection that goes on with when you're talking about how Russia don't understand the American system. Is that partly because they can't get past that other nations could be so different from themselves?
I think it's an excellent question, actually, Jonathan, because you've put your finger on something that's really important. They don't just think that our democracy is something that's got to be chased out of the world. They don't believe it exists. They don't believe it's real. So let's go back to the very first thing I said in our chat, that attempted assassination takes you from the space of political opposition to the space of political enemies. Certainly Putin and a good portion of the elite around him don't believe in political opposition at all. They don't believe that that is a meaningful political concept. They think that this is Western discourse that is actually ephemeral. That once you properly look at how Western societies work, that'll be just froth atop a glass that can be blown off to reveal a genuine relationship of friends and enemies beneath. And that leads them to all kinds of bizarre views, such as the view that the British Prime Minister will write what the BBC will say on the news. So they really struggle, almost in the kindergarten sort of way, at making judgments about the genuine, fragile and wobbly, but genuine independence of our institutions, and about the genuine degree of, if you like, cooperative opposition that still exists in our country. They do not believe that the form of government that is fragile, wonky, but sacred and precious that we have exists. And that is absolutely them extrapolating their own experiences onto us in a way that is simply false.
And I think sorry, you go ahead.
I was just to kind of confirm what Vlad was saying there, as if that's needed. I was reading Sean Pinner's book. So Sean Pinner, I've interviewed him on my channel. Fascinating guy. He was fighting for the Ukrainians as a former British soldier, but as a kind of, I don't know, he had Ukrainian citizenship, but he'd been there prior to this version of the war from 2022 onwards, and then was captured, and then was exchanged for was it Medvedchuk, and he was giving an account in his book on how he was dealing with the UK media, because they were asking him to phone these newspapers up to try and almost broker his own exchange. And he was speaking to these soldiers who were like completely blown away that these newspapers could print what they liked, that they didn't have to get permission from the UK government, that actually by speaking to the newspapers, he wouldn't be by extension speaking to the UK government. And there was this, like, for you and I, it's like, well, obviously these are free and fair, like, media entities to a large extent. But there wasn't that common knowledge within it appears, the Russian people who were holding them captive. And I thought that's just a fascinating
Just
insight.
a very quick remark. It's not just that they think that in the Kremlin that democracy isn't real. They also really have that thought sit in them as an ideology. I won't say what I mean by ideology, but it's part of the ideology of Putinism that might is right. That doesn't mean that they say that out loud or even think that that's part of their ideology consciously. But it is a central part of that ideology. And within that ideological constriction, there is no space for you and I getting in each other's way and then finding a reasonable way of coexisting that's not just about one of us exercising power over the other.
I think that's a very fundamental idea, which is, and you get this in business, is the idea that you can have a win-win scenario where I benefit, you benefit. Then it's a matter of really the fine print, detailing exactly what's going to be involved in that transaction. I suspect that in Russian mindset you described there in the political structure, there's no real concept of a win-win. It's a
not, it's
win-lose
just to
scenario.
quickly comment here, it's not win-win, it's win-lose with the loser accepting the legitimacy of the process.
Exactly.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, that's it. And that's why it's so easier for, say, Turkey, Erdogan and Putin to discuss, because you instinctively have an understanding who has the upper hand, who has the power perhaps in a given situation, and then you work accordingly. You're not being bound by sets of rules, which we call the international order, whereas Russia might see that as an arbitrary exercise of us trying to impose power from a position of weakness. I mean, it seems that not only are they implacably opposed to rule of law, they fundamentally don't understand the mechanism of it, and perhaps see the necessity of it. I don't know.
I think there's some interesting thought going on about this, about whether there is a connection between this type of ideology expressed domestically, which a lot of writers, and Greg Utin is a good example, trace back to the anarcho-capitalism of early 1990s Russia, a sort of acceptance of war of all against all, not just as a realistic default, but as a kind of normatively impeccable situation. And there's a tendency to want to link that with Russia's unbounded conduct on the international stage. And I think this is an interesting discussion and a very interesting literature that's slowly growing. We shouldn't be glib about making that connection straight away, but it's an interesting topic of discussion. How far is a certain kind of might is right ideology that emerged in part from the 90s and then got put into shape in various ways by the Putin regime, that also is expressed in a kind of direct extension sort of way in Russia's foreign policy. I think that's interesting. We in the West, of course, are much clearer that we don't live like that in domestic politics. In our foreign policy, it's much more mixed, I think.
I'm
And
interested.
it has big implications, doesn't it? I'll let you in a second, John. It has big implications for what happens if or when Trump wins, because the might makes right dictates a foreign policy which is much more aligned with the idea of spheres of influence, going back to the Potsdam or whatever, carving Europe up. And it's very much based on that sort of power where you can project power. That's not the kind of world we want to see, but what the outcome of November's election may determine whether we live in a world of returning spheres of influence or the rule of law as it's defined following the Second World War.
I want Jonathan to come in, but I just make a quick remark. Trump will be disappointed by how far he finds Putin ideologically different to himself, because might is right is not the only part of Putin's ideology. There are very many missionary and mystical elements there, which means that Putin is going to be much harder to deal with, as though you deal as you deal with some kind of business partner you're trying to make a tough deal with. So Trump's going to be in for a disappointment in that respect, because what I've named as a feature of Russian ideology is a feature among many other features. And a lot of the other features have qualities that almost verge in the direction of a kind of religious fundamentalism.
But what I was going to say, perfectly aligned to this, and actually maybe Vlad can expand on whether there is or isn't a parallel between Trump and Putin, in terms of Trump is very well known as a transactionalist. I would call a micro-transactionalist, from very sees things in a very narrow kind of context, and it's a zero-sum game, very much like doing a business deal. So he doesn't really understand alliances where you can have positive sum gains, where there can be a win-win situation. So NATO is something exactly like that. And part of the reason I think that he actually cognitively misunderstands what NATO is, intellectually misunderstands what NATO is. I don't think he really gets it. But the idea that it's an alliance where you get a return on investment that isn't just a simply, I pay this, you've paid that, I've paid more than you, therefore I'm paying for this more and you owe me stuff, and therefore you're the bad guy to be the good guy. That really simplistic idea of how he goes about doing his, in this case, foreign policy. And Madeleine Albright in her book Fascism talked about Trump being really transactionalist in his foreign policy, and that is, I think, a problem when we live in this globalist society, global world, where you need to have a little bit more nuance than that, and you need to be working with people to these greater ends. Now, how much is Putin like that? It seems like Vlad's saying that there are elements of transactionalism with Putin, maybe, but actually there are other things going on as well. And would Putin, if Trump sees the world in this very much zero-sum game way, and as such doesn't really understand alliances and how to operate in that fashion, so he retreats, whilst also into kind of isolationism, while also trying to portray himself as being a strong man and he could take on X, Y, and Z. Yeah, how does that play with Putin? How would Putin try and play Trump? And I'd be interested in Vlad's opinions on how transactional Putin is,
and what it means for Ukraine, which is not in that NATO structure, but is clearly the largest military force with the largest amount of direct experience of modern warfare in Europe. It's an interesting kind of equation there, Vlad.
Well, it's hard. I think the situation is really, really hard, especially with the highly, highly likely now Trump victory. A hard situation for Ukraine. Not a catastrophic situation, but a hard situation. So I mentioned that there are many elements to Putin's thinking, I think, that are not transactional. But there is another detail here, and that is Putin is transactional in the way that Trump will not be able to understand. So their transactionality is different. And what do I mean by that? I mean by that Putin is fighting a defensive existential war in his mind in Ukraine. And not only do I think he thinks that, I think he is correct. I think that a democratic Ukraine, in Putin's analysis, outside of the EU, outside of NATO, without an army, let's say hypothetically, right? Give Putin all of these fantasies. That kind of Ukraine is an existential threat to his power, because it makes Belarus 2020 much more likely to happen in Russia in 2028. And therefore, Putin sees the mere existence of an independent Ukraine outside any Western alliances as a threat to his power and to his body. It is a mortal and genuine, serious, physical threat to him. And he thinks of himself as Russia. So taking care of threats to his body is incredibly important. So if Trump thinks that's negotiable, he's going to run into a brick wall. That is a transactional position. That is actually not profoundly mystical or missionary. It just says that is genuinely destabilizing to my regime. My regime's security is incompatible with Ukraine existing as an independent country. So uh, Trump will have a problem with that if he thinks that Putin can spin and turn and compromise all around this. So that's the bit of transactionality on which they might be incompatible. I do think that the big risk with Trump, and this is what the Russians are hoping for, is that Ukraine will be pushed into a peace deal without security guarantees. And we can take security guarantees sort of vaguely as giving Ukraine enough weapons to feel confident, keep the Russians out if and when they come again. The aim of the Kremlin is full political control over Ukraine still. That's one way to think about Ukraine's security. Another way that I think is essential is that it gets some kind of genuine security guarantees from the West that's more than just help and support. Doesn't necessarily have to take the form of NATO. But I think without that, Ukraine's economy is in trouble. Ukraine's political stability is in trouble, and there is an outside chance of Ukraine losing its sovereignty. Make this absolutely clear. Ukraine's sovereignty is not secured yet. It can be secured by not that much, but a little bit of strategic sustenance from the West over the next few years. That is doable. But the Kremlin will be hoping that Ukraine will be pushed into a deal that is both threatening to it and politically unacceptable to it. And that'll mean political instability at home. That'll mean a government being pushed into something it either doesn't want to do or it does, but then has to lose power as a result. So that's their plan A scenario with Trump. But they're also sitting there thinking, we might not get everything we want, and this is an unpredictable situation.
Can I come in there on this idea of an existential crisis for Putin that is connected to the war in a way that the outcome of the war is not so connected to, say, Zelensky. So Zelensky, as a leader of Ukraine, will continue existing as a human, have a wife and his kids, and live his life, whether Ukraine win or whether they don't, right? And that is, I think, really important to understanding how Zelensky might be making his decisions. The country is essentially linked to the outcome of the war as a sovereign nation, etc., etc. But with Russia, the country of Russia or the Russian Federation is not existentially connected to the outcome of this war in the way that it is for Ukraine. You can argue to some extent, but it is for Putin. There's almost like this asymmetry, this inversion there, where if Russia lose this war, like in a considerable way, then actually that could be the end of a dictator, right? And the ends of dictators don't usually go, let's go and retire into our mansion by the Black Sea and live out our life of luxury with my 11 super yachts, right? He is either going to die, he might be dying of natural causes, that's another thing to throw in, but or he's going to be deposed or, you know, end up in a gulag or whatever. So there are these, I think, real possibilities that Putin's life is existentially linked to the outcome of this war, and then that informs the sorts of decisions he makes. So you get this kind of Putin paradox where the better Ukraine do, the more likely it is that Putin is going to do something outrageous, which ends up being worse for Ukraine. So there's a kind of bit of a paradox there, and I think it's linked to this idea that the outcome of the war threatens Putin's very existence. I don't know if that's something Vlad would agree with at all.
Well,
I
I've
think that
spoken too much.
links,
I'll let John take us forward.
that links the 90s mindset because, you know, and this is the very real sense I got because, you know, I spent a couple of years in the 90s, him in a communalka of all places for 1 year. But the sense was, and I think everyone felt it, that whatever you'd earned, whether you'd, got your own flat or done your own kitchen, or whether you had a mansion, or whether you had become part of the super elite as Putin became, I think the sense was common to everybody that it's not quite an imposter syndrome, but that your parents' generation didn't have any of this. You know that a few years prior to you gaining these fabulous riches, no one had anything even approaching that. You're also acutely aware that if you can just have these magical riches by exerting power or doing some kind of cleverness or whatever, somebody else can do the same to you. So I think all Russians have always had this sense that whatever you accrue, whatever you accumulate, it could disappear in a moment because someone could come along and take it. And I think Putin's no different than anybody else in that respect. He's just built a bigger stash, a little bit like the dragon and the Hobbit sitting on that huge pile of gold coins, and he's jealously sort of guarding that. But it could all disappear in a moment. There's no rule of law or no right of inheritance to protect anybody's wealth, I think.
I
Well,
think
I think,
that
yeah.
sorry,
Go
just
on,
going to
Jonathan.
just really quickly say I wholeheartedly can agree with what you're saying, at least intuitively, that there's a real fragility to everyone's existence. When you can have anything taken off you by the state, the rule of the law is the rule of a dictator. Whereas in my country, I can try challenge a state in a court of law. I can defer to the rule of law, etc., etc. And so the welfare state gives me this element of safety net. And actually, I can understand that in Russia that even if there is some kind of a welfare state, actually the FSB can come and take anything off you at any point in time. And yeah, there must be this widespread, I guess, cultural understanding that everything you have sits upon a very fragile foundation.
Not even the FSB. I mean, it's behind the scenes. It's not a monolithic autocracy. There are competing interests, competing groups. So I'll let Vlad come in. So you usually express this with incredible eloquence.
Well, I think that Putin, of course, also sees his own population as an existential threat to him. And so his view before the war, in my interpretation, was that another 5 years of a demobilized population is incompatible with regime security. This is a regime that's absolutely obsessed with Poles. And they realized they'd lost the younger generation by a very, 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 very big margin. People in their 20s in Russia are profoundly alienated from this regime. What Putin wanted to do is not so much to put them back in line, but to maybe skip that generation and bring up another generation of people who are much more ideologically mobilized. And that's why you are seeing this extreme fascization of Russia's education system right now. And I say fascization not just because they are beginning to teach kids as though education is prep for war, but they're beginning to teach kids in a way that says war is an end in itself. You'd never got that in the Soviet Union. That is an element that drifts us into fascist ideology. But that's the problem for Putin. He is scared of his own people. Gorbachev, verbatim, told Putin, "Why are you so afraid of your own people?" That's a verbatim quote from Gorbachev. And Putin felt that in a demobilized form, he couldn't continue in this, with society being in a demobilized form, it couldn't continue. So again, this element of regime security coming in, but now toward concerns about his own concerns about his own population. And so they could be the people who come to get his stuff. Because there is indeed an ideological gap between the regime and the people. The people who very positively oppose the war in Russia is a minority, but the people who very positively support it is a minority too. Most of the population is extravagantly depoliticized, But there's also some possibility to make judgments about what exactly the tendencies of the depoliticized blob are. And Putin was worried about that. He felt that there was too much of a scary divergence between the population and himself, and he needed to take action. Otherwise, they'd come. And if Ukraine's free, they're going to be inspired to come for me.
Do you think there's a similarity between, say, and I know this is going to be divisive for people who are big fans of Trump, but the cult of Trump, that cult of personality where any criticism of Trump is, and I've read several articles on this, that it is akin to blasphemy, and you just cannot criticize Trump politically, and it becomes all very tribal. Do you think that exists with, obviously it does structurally with the control that Putin has, but do you think that that's also something that is embedded in the psyche of Russians, such that there is this inbuilt deification of Putin, so that he can't be criticized, and therefore don't allow themselves to believe that Putin could do wrong?
I don't think that most Russians agree with what Putin is doing specifically, ever. They just outsource politics to him. In other words, the thought isn't that because Putin does it, it must be right. The thought is Putin is the only institution with political legitimacy in the country, and we hope that he's doing the right thing. And that's the feeling about the war. It's even the feeling of most of the Russian soldiers about the war. We don't know why this is happening, but surely it wouldn't happen unless there were good reasons for it, even though I don't know what they are. So it's a case of a kind of inferential justification. So if you're talking about, can Russians criticize Putin? The answer is that's almost the wrong way to start the conversation, because they don't take a view on what Putin does specifically. They just take a general view that Putin is hopefully doing his job competently, but we shouldn't enter into conversations about whether a particular action he takes is right or wrong. We should just say we outsource politics to him, and having done that, it's bye-bye to political opinions.
But that's fascinating that you answer like that, because when I talked about the deification of Putin, what you expound there sounds really similar to the problem of evil argument, which is what you'd say of God. Well, how can evil take place if God is all-knowing, all powerful, and all loving? Then surely, all of this evil that must be taking place, all the suffering on the earth must be explicable. There must be a justified reason for it, because otherwise my entire belief system about a God falls apart. And so therefore you have this almost like a priori belief that even all these horrors must be all right. They must be part of the plan.
Yeah, and it's very scary to begin admitting that things are going really wrong, because it means you have to question everything about your relationship with politics. So let's take a very typical sort of internet move. You show a Russian who is skeptical that the country is doing anything wrong pictures of horrors they've caused in Ukraine, and they say, "Oh, not sure if this is real. Oh, maybe we didn't do this. Maybe nobody knows really the truth about what you're showing me." So where is that defensiveness coming from? It's coming not out of ignorance, but out of resistance to admitting something that would require complete transformation in how you understand your relationship with your own government. And so that very much motivates people to keep sticking to this inferential justification. Okay, it's a Tuesday morning and Putin decided to launch a nuclear strike on Russia. Maybe. Now I'm really exaggerating beyond the realm of the plausible here, but there'll be almost a tendency for people to say, well, he must have a good reason to do that. I mean,
yeah, see, this is what I talk about all the time. Sorry, John, but this is cognitive dissonance reduction, which is whereby you have a core belief and then you have evidence against that belief, and generally your core belief will maintain, and you have to do something with the evidence against your belief so that it gets subsumed by your core belief, or is somehow integrated with your core belief, or just outright rejected. So if what you were saying then, Vlad, was, yeah, we've seen pictures of like terrible acts taking place, war crimes, and we know my core belief is that I'm a good person and everything I do is morally brilliant and perfect, because otherwise my own sense of my own identity falls apart. And my idea of my nation, and therefore Putin, because I'm part of this is part of me, and I am Russian, and therefore there's this synthesis between a personal identity and a national identity. And so therefore, if Putin or your nation does something horrific over here, that is the same as me doing something horrific over there. But I can't do something horrific. I can't be bad. My nation can't be bad. Therefore, this didn't happen, like Vlad says, or they deserved it. Ukraine Nazis, less than human. This is how fascism works, right? And this is your cognitive dissonance reduction. And then what maintains is that, yep, I'm a good person. My nation is correct. Putin is correct, and all of those identities are wrapped up in one.
The real challenge, of course, is going to be, I mean, to turn it back to Ukraine, is that we've got a fundamental problem here where there's this process in the media and everywhere else to sort of normalize what is an abnormal situation, impose or project our own framework, our own way of thinking onto it. Vlad, you mentioned Biden. Unfortunately, him and some of his policymakers behind him are constantly, I think, looking at Russia and looking at it through the lens of their own values, which doesn't necessarily help to a successful outcome in dealing with Russia. But the real challenge here is that what Putin really wants is not to conquer Ukraine physically, not to steal all its resources. These are byproducts of that process. What he wants is for Ukrainians to treat him as the man god, the infallible kind of man-czar god, which you're sort of alluding to there. Whether he understands their agency, their political processes, their institutions or not, fundamentally, they're not treating him with the reverence which he thinks he deserves there. And if they carry on doing that, I fear, genocide is what they turn to when they cannot break people's minds and wills in the way they would desire.
I think that gives Ukraine too much agency in Putin's views. I don't think there's any real problem of convincing Ukrainians of anything as far as he is concerned, either because you can convince them, he thinks, or if you can't, you can just make them stuck in a certain situation they don't like. The problem isn't Ukrainians being resistant. The problem is that this is simply a projection of US imperialism. And it's an unnatural projection of US imperialism in Putin's view. And as soon as US imperialism rebalances itself into the right geographical proportions for itself, it'll realize that it just cannot have a priority of interest in Eastern Europe, all Eastern Europe, in fact, and that interest will start diminishing. And if that happens, then he probably doesn't know what will happen to being a Ukrainian, which is an ideology for Putin. It's a sort of a fake ideology, and these people are kind of Russians in denial. So it's not like Chechnya, where there's genuinely a group of others, outsiders, foreigners, who may need to be civilized. It's a different kind of imperial enterprise where you think that the people who are not you are you, but they're in denial about being you. And that, he thinks, may persist, but fundamentally it shouldn't be a big problem. He thinks once US imperialism gets out. So no, he's not sitting there thinking that he's got to inflict the greatest number of physical casualties possible. He's happy to inflict physical casualties amongst civilians along the way of realizing his project of destabilizing Ukraine, making Ukraine ungovernable, and consolidating his own power. So that's a little bit of a skirt around your question, I think.
Is it not so much about US imperialism as it is about Russian imperialism, though? I mean, I read it more that US imperialism and NATO expansionism is more of a post hoc rationalization, and after the fact way of justifying his own Peter the Great Russian expansionism. He sees himself, you know, in the way that Jonathan was saying, as a kind of God-man figure, a la a king, as the new Peter the Great. Is it, you know, how much is this Russian expansionism versus the threat of US expansionism?
It's a threat of US expansionism onto the territory of that appropriately should belong to Russian Empire. So Putin does genuinely believe that France and Spain are sovereign countries, but he doesn't believe that Poland or Latvia are sovereign countries. Their sovereignties are toy sovereignties. And you can play this game of pretense as long as you like, but eventually toy sovereignties don't hold very well. They just don't. And over and above that, it just doesn't think it's a natural space for the projection of US power. And again, in his recent speech, where he gave the ultimatum, he implicitly asked for the withdrawal of NATO from all of Eastern Europe. That was an important thing that the media missed, actually. So he does think that this is the most outrageous, unbelievable expression of provocative US imperialism. That's not the same point as saying that NATO expansion triggered Putin. That's a different argument, I think. But Putin's problem isn't so much with NATO's expansion. It's almost a problem with NATO's existence.
No.
But he absolutely does not recognize the claims about the agency of East European countries that said, we want to join, as being a meaningful political force. And it's again back to what we were saying before. It's not that he thinks they should have been stopped from joining because they don't matter. Over and above that, he thinks that the very idea that they have a sovereignty that they will insist on, and they seem to be insisting on it very strongly, but still, the very idea that they have a sovereignty that they're insisting on is somehow a sick political construct that has to be washed away.
But surely, like, how does, I don't know if he has answered the criticism, how does Putin answer the criticism that he's just cherry picking chronology or an era? So he believes in the essence, so some kind of essentialism whereby the Russian nation, the Russian Federation, Soviet, whatever you want to call it, has some kind of objective facticity that stretches to these places, but not to other places, right? So the Baltics are part of the Russian Empire, quote unquote, and Ukraine is part of the Russian Empire. But then you just go, well, you're just using this time period, but what about 100 years before that or 200 years after that? And that's just, these are easy arguments to back down. Has there anyone ever like challenged him on these ideas, or does he just get away with cherry picking his idea of what Russia is?
The people closest around him, like the Kovalchuk brothers and Patrushev and a few others, tend to be sympathetic to that view. I don't think it would make sense for somebody who Putin trusted to sort of doxastically challenge him on beliefs, because these things are expressed really at the level of images. If you listen to the Russian, Oxford-based Russian historian Zorin, he often talks about something that I caricature in my own language as a desire to propel Russia from the back row to the front row of nations in a single swoop. That's a very strange, somewhat mystical vision of it being actually advantageous to start as a loser, because that will somehow help you win rapidly on toward the finishing line. That's a kind of image. I believe something like that is one of the things in his head. And I don't think we can debate it in propositional terms. I also think something in his head is a sort of Wagnerian idea that the will of a single individual, Putin, is now inseparable from the cultural self-realization of all Russia. And these are thoughts that are very weird for us, are very alien to us. And back to our conversation about, understanding across borders, our risk is trying to put Russia into a John Mearsheimer type realist box, driven by motivations that can be sort of dealt with in thought that's sort of akin to cost-benefit analysis. And I think that the situation is a lot more weird. I could be wrong. I'm not, but I could be wrong. It's worth debating. But what I am saying is that this is obviously a rational actor, in the sense that Putin thinks about what he does profoundly, but he's not a rational actor in the narrow sense that the Soviet Union was, where you could much more clearly predict what it might do, according to considerations that you would read in a entry economics or rationality textbook for undergraduates. So we're dealing with something that's a little bit closer to Al-Qaeda in some ways than to the Soviet Union. And that's why we have to admit they're rational, but we need a wider conception of rationality to deal with them. So the holes you've just sort of shot in Putin's thinking, Jonathan, and his historical claims is absolutely correct. But I think the holes are so embarrassingly obvious that we have to push deeper to some of the images that structure this outlook to understand why it sits in him so well. But then the other just very prosaic point is people are not going to challenge him about his historical narratives, which have got worse because he continued this self-narration, in part with one of the Kovalchuk brothers during the pandemic isolation. And I think he's sort of dived ever deeper into this somewhat mystical way of thinking about Russia's past and future. And this is why we ran into trouble. Imagine describing what I've just described to Keir Starmer, or to Joe Biden. It's hard. You can say, well, they clearly have this territorial claim they're making. We can understand where it's coming from. But when you're trying to describe a motivation that is a bit more mystical, it's very hard to actually get, well, it's hard to get democracies to move on anything, but it's very hard to get complex bureaucratic systems to move on the comprehension that the regime is a bit more radical than they think in these kinds of directions. So that's a kind of political problem we in the West face. We're not grasping how radical a project this is.
When a dictator lives in an epistemic bubble with no practical ways of having those beliefs challenged by the people around him, because he's placed those people around him probably precisely because they shore up his belief system, then there is no way of being able to disconfirm your beliefs, and that's where we are.
And I think one of the challenges is that even if those would be broken down internally in some way, and people, this amorphous for expression, people were to somehow express their views to him, unfortunately, I think you'd find there are a lot of people in Russia who perhaps in an ill-defined way, but an equally mystical way, share some of these ideas. I mean, I had numerous conversations in the 90s, way before Putin came to power, and it was quite apparent that many, if not majority of Russians I spoke to on this topic, even then had no concept of what Baltic sovereignty was, no concept that was a valid thing to even talk about. So a lot of these ideas predate Putin. They're not invented by him. Therefore, I think unrooting them is especially challenging there. And I don't think it will come internally. And this is really, I guess we'll probably have to make this the last question, because with the ascent of Trump into a second term, with, as Vlad said, the slow moving pace of European reaction, that may actually speed up ironically based on what's happened over the weekend. But we are still locked into a process of escalation management, which is based on a rational way of looking at Russia, a rational geopolitical, geoeconomical kind of framework. That seems to me doomed to fail because it fundamentally fails to understand what's being dealt with. The Ukrainians, I think, understand it far better. and that is that force. Force and the exertion of force and will is possibly the only way to deal with this. That's not to say to conquer Russia, that's really not going to happen, but simply to say, we do not agree with your ideas, and we have the force and the will to just push them out. Is that too simplistic, Vlad?
Let me just briefly come in and first of all make a comment about this sort of top-down, bottom-up story that we always have to talk about when we talk about dictators. There was a tendency before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine for Russia commentators in the West to look at Putin as a kind of an example of vertical power who has taken his people hostage. A lot of the very same people, I'm watching them, a lot of the very same people are now saying the very opposite, that in fact Putin is fairly aligned with the population. Both positions are wrong. What I think you felt in Russia, absolutely rightly, is a kind of unboundariness that is very typical of unprocessed imperial history and ambitions. And the unboundariness is really about the idea that you are loose with what's not yours. It has a place in private life for a lot of Russians too, but there's this looseness with stuff that isn't yours. Well, you've crossed our borders, well, so what? And so that kind of unboundaries, I do think is there, and I do think it affects over half of the population. I do think that is different, though, to mystical visions about projecting force abroad, which I think holds for about 20% of the population. But the unboundedness holds for 60%. In terms of Ukraine, I don't think we will develop a strategy about defeating Putin. I think democratically that asks too much of our democracy's capacities. However, we can, even without understanding fully what motivates the Kremlin, and I don't expect that we will in the major Western centers of power, but we can, even within that limitation, give Ukraine enough sustained aid and military support, and also move more efficaciously than we're doing now towards some kind of security guarantees for Ukraine. If we do that, there is a prospect that Ukraine will be economically viable, that it'll be politically stable, and that it'll be a sovereign state. But all these three things, especially the first two, are still, in my opinion, unsettled and dependent on the strength of our support. I do think that, setting realistically low ambitions, we can still see within that picture a way forward that is not devoid of tragedy, but it is hopeful about Ukraine's economic viability, political stability, and sovereignty. What is less hopeful is reacquisition of territory. In other words, there is no chance whatsoever that unless some major incident of escalation occurs, that major Western powers will back Ukraine to liberate its territories. That will not happen. Ukraine might liberate its territories under some freak occurrence or under some change of conditions in Russia, but it will not occur because the West has backed it to do that. That will not be happening.
Yes, I mean, goodness me, that's a whole other conversation. That's good. That would take another few hours to unpick that because how does this war end is, oh, goodness me. But I would like to say, going back to Trump and a potential Trump presidency, that I think that would definitely be a challenge for the Ukrainians. I think that as it stands, unless Trump goes down the narcissistic route and says but it would take his people around him to convince him that he could become the hero, and by becoming the hero he could save Ukraine by giving all of this stuff to Ukraine, and it would be all about Trump, and Trump gets to win Ukraine for the Ukrainians and give one over to Putin. Like, that is the only option for a positive outcome of a Trump presidency for Ukraine. But I just think that's highly unlikely given the people around him, his family, his sons, all of the the elites or whatever those advisors he has around him are now so set in stone. They aren't the people from 2016 where you had some serious political people. Even Mike Pompeo and people like that were, you know, not my type of politician, but actually those were people who could advise Trump somewhat sensibly. So I think that's a problem. But my hopium is that actually, I know both of you have said that Trump now seems dead on favorite to win the election. I've watched a pollster talk about this today. He said, to be honest, that this will probably blow over to some degree. This is early enough in the race, and that you will see a bounce, and you'll see a bounce at the Republican National Committee convention that's taking place this week. But if it's going to come down to reproductive rights and ideas of felon versus, I mean, it depends whether Biden gets replaced or not, but it is not as dyed in the wool as you think it might be. There could well be an opportunity for the polls to reconfigure after this blows over. But I think a lot will depend on who the shooter is, as I mentioned earlier.
Just a tiny comment on Ukraine's point of view. Obviously, I'd love you to be right about this, Jonathan, more than anything in the world. If you are a US citizen who wants to keep their democratic institutions, you prefer Biden over Trump, obviously, but you're also deeply worried about the damage to US democracy of a second Biden term, because you cannot have a president with significant cognitive decline. That will do a lot less damage than a president who's out to break democratic institutions. But both scenarios are a democratic worry for US citizens, understandably. However, Ukraine is an existential situation, and the next 2, 3, 4 years are desperately important.
Yeah.
So if you're an American citizen thinking you're going to vote for Biden, even if Biden is just sleeping through his term, that argument is even more compelling for Ukrainians who need support and sustenance in the very short term, and they're not thinking about needing US democracy 15 years from now to support them. They're thinking about that too. That's important. But Ukraine needs help now. So the pro-Biden case, from a Ukrainian vantage point, is even stronger than it is from a US point of view. So if you're Ukrainian, you want not Trump. You probably want Biden to step down. I
totally agree.
You probably want Biden to step down and be replaced if you're Ukrainian, because that might increase the chance of Trump losing. But you are desperate for anything other than Trump if you're Ukrainian. And these thoughts that American citizens might have that Biden is better, but that his second term may do a bit of damage too, just at the level of presentation and communication. That thought isn't really a priority for Ukrainians, because they're desperate to not lose the support that they need.
I have so many debates with people on my threads who are pro-Ukraine, but still, some of them still weirdly, really pro-Trump. And I'm like, you cannot hold to both those things. Like, well, you can, but you have to accept that Ukraine takes this, is not on the agenda for Trump. So yep, you can be a Trump fan and you can like him for all these things, but he will not, unless there's that sort of change I was talking about earlier, he will not support Ukraine, and Ukraine need a non-Trump presidency. And I wasn't talking about necessarily being Biden. There could be a second choice. There could be a Kamala Harris or similar. But yeah, those are my views. I think for Ukraine's future to be more likely assured, you need Trump not to win.
I think that I tend towards that as well. I find it endlessly curious. I've spoken to some influential Republicans who are pro-Ukraine, influential Democrats who are pro-Ukraine, even spoken to some people who worked under Obama's national security team. And they also are in this rather odd space that I don't quite comprehend, where they're like, well, Trump's unpredictable. He could go one way, he could go the other. And I don't see that happening. But I think Europe needs to focus on the consequences, the worst case scenario, and plan for it. And then we can be pleasantly surprised if we're all wrong. I'm guessing that's where we are at this point in time. Take action rather than endlessly
And
debating the
I think the EU and NATO
possibilities.
are doing that. So they are doing. If you listen to all the analysts talking about the outcome of the NATO summit, there was an awful lot of right. We need to mitigate against the Trump presidency, and the same in the EU. So I think that is happening.
And the last word to you, Vlad. Do you what's your advice there for being action oriented at this point rather than sort
Well,
of going to
back
throw
to
the dice?
where we started for American citizens. You can't achieve anything without keeping your democracy. You can't achieve Ukraine policy, can't achieve climate policy. Democracy is an all issues issue. And at a time like this, when things get a bit more existential, my advice is to think in terms of effective rather than expressive politics a little bit more, and to try to be less existential in the way you relate to your political opponents, even if you feel they pose an existential threat.
I
Gentlemen,
think
that's absolutely fantastic. Oh, Jonathan, yeah.
I was sorry, I know you're trying to go, but I think this idea that you become too tribalist and too escalatory, then you are letting go of actual policy, of actual the substance of governance, and that is to the detriment of the people of the US.
This is, I think, an incredibly important discussion. I hope some people are listening who have some kind of policy making capabilities. But of course, anyone who's listening to this can get more involved in helping Ukraine and in helping to prolong or extend a reasonable debate on this topic rather than the tribalism and partisanship, which both Vlad and Jonathan have talked about. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we will watch the space, see how this evolves, and potentially schedule more of these if the audience enjoyed and found value in them.